Che Ninkung Dele, and a very good morning to Katrina Brooks as well, and to everybody online. Thank you for joining us. And we'll begin with some prayers that you'll find in the chat box.
To the teacher and Tao, transcendent destroyer, oneness gone, full destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one unto bliss, nor the world's supreme guide of beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha and Tao, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you pay 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise and I bow, with pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme sign, stays like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not incomparable, wise one, to you I bow. Great, compassionate, protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, true virtue, freeing from the lower realms, unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings, the holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame on a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the 4 faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, 4 lands, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Iram Guru Ramna Mandalakam Yatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Oh yeah. This one.
This one again.
Oh yeah. Oh, tiene carengo. More. Tiene chizonga pa chimbisong lera. Tae dende shin no le las. Dende nyeba tare samshin. Nye gan jigla namge lo dandra. Tsundi samshin chikden chaokun. Gumba chawa shindu tochi ne nyezen gudu nyimbu le makwes. Nejo nge janyam le tudar she tandi ke jet shin kyang se los. Oh she song badara. Ngarazo tanda top debe melody sungara. Tenjorki melody se. Ishingi nobu. Tene le labare so. Tewe tende shindo le las. Ishin nobu de karsora. Ane trua sumda shiva sumshikte. Zamarab söze ane. Togalia genje zemole chuni chiba chana. Se di se ku lojula soba kanga. Pongba meba yungu yisigora. O tende ishin nobu. Kya tong chimpum tsi ina ya. Se di ko togu tamsong la soba kari na ti. Yon togu mato. Tila labo chiga tenjo ku miliu ki di tende tup tung genge. Kya tup tupe tanda tama. Kya chima me son la me tonga. Tata mi ko ba tamsi ya. Dila tende tup tuku ma re songora. Ti sonza tewe tende ishin nobu. Kya tong chimpum le jan labo re songore. Tewe tende ishin no le las. O de tish songna. Ya.
So, here, as the Master Jelama Tsongkhapa has said, this life of leisure is even more precious than a wish-granting jewel. That I have found such an existence is only just this once. So hard to find, yet like a flash of lightning, it is easy to vanish. So, here, contemplating this situation, it's vital to realize that all mundane pursuits are like the empty grain husks floating in the wind, and that we must extract the essence of this human existence. So the life of leisures and endowments that we have right now, this is something that is extremely precious, even more precious than a wish-granting jewel. So if you have this kind of wish-granting jewel and you clean it and you put it in a special sort of place up on the roof or whatever, it's able to dispel all poverty. It can fulfill all of the kinds of needs of this life in terms of granting us food or wealth and clothing and so forth. But here, the kind of life that we have right now is even more precious than hundreds of those, thousands of those, because a wish-granting jewel doesn't have the ability to even, at the very least, ensure that we have a good human rebirth in the future. And so despite the kind of ability of such a gem or thousands of them to dispel whatever poverty we might have in this life, our life that we have, this precious human rebirth with its leisures and endowments, is far more precious than that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, tawe tende shindo le las. Yung ngarazo tenjo ki milu di susu mechi di siwara. Pecho yabu cheba ina. Neko ishin nobu le lakba na shi tanda tup tuku resa. Tena ngarazo samli dalya tanda milu Koran di mechi Koran ke chibu tanda alfa. Tangsha mato te penche ki yun ringbu maung ba te pe tamme bari shirwa. Maung be dewa tang tungye tanda te tamme bari te. Chen de ko chibu ta milu lan sa te kare ne ko 강에 여도 여기를 대삼지 되게 내가 지금 말도 교황을 시대 전에 탐내고 삼을 땅게 되나 나와서 야전에 토마메바 마전에 배 이름 무시부지 이거 소자 뒤던다 간거 삼을 땅게 와라 세대 집에 던다 많이 봐 마음 봐 용주 던다 간거 삼을 땅게 되게 셔를 쓰고라 어디 인도 아주 메시지 저 치마 페이지가 던다 온도 함이 고봐 아니 타르바 코알라 땐도 코르마 고베 타바 대 라체고 마이바 심제 탐제가 tontuk통되게 산제지 고방 주베가 탑시 단다 고츠냐 전에 제에 버치레스 와라 어 근데 가야 마셔세 세디 지부 사야 통해 거야 티 지부 전달이야 계셔바이나 아니 빼 방부래 송거라 되던데 신 노래라 되더니 뭐 다른 잠시 니가 지글라 남벨로던데 근데 매일 사시부터 왜 다른 렌즈자 토르 마트데 따버르시 망부로 시비지 톱쳐져 여기 텐데 말을 써라. 대단히 바다를 잠시 인세. 저 다른 밀로 야부터 바데 배주 야부 제신 것이 거래 송거라. 야, 어디죠?
So, when we talk about this life of leisures and endowments, the kind of human life that we have right now, if we use it well, we can accomplish something quite meaningful. But often we only think of this life. We're not really contemplating the future, our future suffering and happiness that is really endless. We are going to take rebirth again and again. And so here, if we are to only think about what it is that we need in this life, using this life in order to get what we need in terms of food or clothing clothing or shelter and so forth, that's quite a limited kind of a vision. And so here, beyond using this sort of human life of leisures and endowments, at the very least, we can make sure if we use it in a meaningful way that we get another rebirth as a human or a god. And even going beyond that, we can pursue liberation from all of samsara, which is in the nature of suffering. And thinking beyond even that, we can attain the state of Buddhahood in which we are able to benefit all sentient beings. And so here, if we are to let ourselves just waste this life, using it to get what we need in terms of food and clothing and the affairs of just this life, that's quite a loss. That's something that's quite sad. And here, as it continues, this is something that we have found just this once. It's not as though we are in a situation where we are going to guaranteed to get a life like this time after time after time, but rather we need to, recognizing the preciousness of this and how it is something extremely rare, put ourselves to making it actually meaningful and thinking about that endless future that lays ahead of us.
Oh, yeah. The identification on the Nibatari. Nika Jiglasera. The Nika Shibuchi Toyarte. Tipe, thank you for Shibuchi, you don't put there in a travel. Oh, Mount Banda Chiches over it. The Marisagora. Shinduna Nika Melu Disagora. Third edition, the Nibatari. Nika Jiglas. Nika was Shibuchi. I take all you don't put thank you for Shibuchi there, you know, I traveled to the Marisa. Jigla would eso, Nika Jigla, Namgelo and us. Namgal ko lubu to colori, Camene, lubu to chicken, Namsan Chig do mato, Kokorangagi Jig do mato, she take a year to book eke omara. Nika Jigla, Namgelo and us. Did send it on that day, but on the Jom Mashimabu, Joshima Yurin Bull Samatana, to the Shunju resident ordo, Nega Yutunduji to that. And the method of Chini Akajin Kasha long of Chutuji Kasha Katerina lo kuchuche tinde te simato shidate ge omarto o ti indicasa ni kan chula namgelo da ras chinde samche chite chao sende meseke de tada chunju re do ase gora tinde samutana chinde samche chite chao bimba chao shintojna chide chao chinde chibu to date ko pakpatinde drui pakpata masuna drag pakpata tinde ya tene kasure charana shire se gora Longlia chana, Duraji patung, anything chana, Lagbal chana, and a lunga papa de paki, do the lategra, Nimbulea chivara. Then she then shall send the chibut on that, send the order, Madame Mambal Panto, a kege or Marisura. She then shall go bimba sauce, papa, Lagbal children, kiss and like leke or mother, send the sauce on this order. Bimba sauce in the document. Ninsen kuntu Nimbulembaku. Sinde chikbu togu tanda membership, Shima Penzela Peg, Nimbu Tondachi, Lentoba Nebato Chigures, wara. We charge the Nimbu Lembaco. Najung Ejan Yamlita, Tando Kijatis Chas. Chetani Chiburani Kijan, Yamlita de Chavese, and Karazu at the Yamlisa Gures. Oh, yeah.
So here, as this verse says, this is something that is so hard to find, yet like a flash of lightning, it is easy to vanish. So this life that we have right now, so precious as it is extremely difficult to find, but it also doesn't last long. If it were the case that this were something that lasted for a very long time, perhaps it would be different. But this life is like a flash of lightning, wherein it flashes for a moment and by its nature disintegrates right away. And so here, when we really think about future lives and the kind of endless future that faces us, this life right now is like a flash of lightning. Although some may live for 50, 60, 80, 90 years, it is still something that is quite short in comparison to the future that we face. And so just to sustain ourselves for this life, doing activities that are only for this life is sort of, as it said, it would be like trying to take the kind of husk of the grain rather than taking the thing that has the essence or the nutrients. As it says, contemplating this situation, it's vital to realize that all mundane pursuits, the activities that we would do for just this life alone, are like the empty grain husks floating in the wind. Like when you beat grain in order to get the actual grain itself, those husks, the skin, just blow off in the wind. There's nothing that really has any essence to it. And so too, to do activities that sustain ourselves but are really just for this life, thinking about getting food and clothing and our reputation refutation. If we expend ourselves in just that, it's quite a waste. It's such a loss. And so therefore, we must extract the essence of this human existence, use it for something more meaningful, thinking about that long future ahead of us, not just engaging in mundane pursuits. And then he says, I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire for liberation too should do likewise. So Je Lama Tsongkhapa, a great yogi, practiced in this way, and we too should follow his example, taking the essence of this life and not getting caught up in just mundane pursuits.
Oh yeah, 어디인데 가서래 가시 다쳤디 다 예치당 알아도 미 관계 시거래 단단단데 고 대화다 강에 들을 삼을다 아마도 이름부 삼을다 해도 꼭꼭 물에 대화라 단단단데 미 삼을 통도 도저히 들이치디나 되게 삼을 마음 발로주 니슈 섬중압주 갱고 차선의 용해대 대주 강가 삼을다 통게 가보러 와 단단단데 가르치는 차삼사 이름부 삼을다 해도 꼭 가보르지와라 어디에도 알아서 세디 장자 다른 무슨도 통해야 돼. 가요 말에 대단한 무슨도 용돼야 들어봐. 대두 간거 다른 무슨도 용돼서자 다들 강에 전부 개시 무시고 좀 멋지라지 통교하라. 어디 이나고 가시 세대마도 다들 개시 그래. 마음바 연하면 간시서 그래. 마음바 연하면 간시서. 맨나도 된대요라. 아니 저를 그렇게 감비박사 나시래. Sendela kara kibji chi tikpata kyawada chi kaji mashasa tumde kaan kibji kaan tende che urusera kyawa chimasa di yo marisa keba tsuku taasi gogo taan sosha risasa tinde suru chaya nyingara tinde karsura mena ko sendela ya chibi tonda machi sude mikiwa shala tsawa pa pemba tu sangbu chi sigawara chio chi siduza xianla penpa tuya tanga cawa ma xe xe, chanpa ta cawa la xi su nani, su su me zi de kibu chi ke, nangmi me zi de kibu chi ke chu, xianda randa rawa yoba zi me zi de kibu chi ke chu, ti tanda chi la kuya ra, ti la chu si go ra, ti chi si go ra, ti che na go, kiawa chi ma yoba ma ye liya ta chuba ke me na ya, ko tola duya ke yo ma rwa, chu xe na kiawa chi ma me na kiawa ra ya ke me duwa, Chendela musumdu chungye den debu kanga chungu dwa raji shenki susu semle shide yungure mile shide yungure chambada tsawe tona tena mesidi kibu yabu shi kaya yora taa kondo nga jaya si kiawa chima yona mena meshi kanchuma chi chana ane zambuli di karso ura nyanga chimbu shi le nyanga yora ti di karso ura kiawa chima yome taa machubi yina ya kiawa chima yoba shijaja chima yoba yina nyanga ra 지단에 그 뭐뭐 강가를 치료 그 뒤이나 매도이나 지시나 저나 그런 교육이 누구도 소연데 지체 티티우레 지시 샤티 또 야치 계체 티치도 그 다음에 생각나서 뒤전도 강가 그렇지 교회를 치진다면도 되기도 와 알아서 소고이나 그 셈다 가가 전에 마음바나 또 대대 가셔서다 또다 가셔 또래 되게 된다 용기도 와 발랑그 것인데 Loma Buchin, but Toto Young Sung better Jabdo Cotton, a bunch of the toa. Then she said, Condamned you end what you did in Georgia. So good to tend to Georgia, Carina Chicha Dodo. Tingam the same Giara. So something as it. Two to draw a mange, two to draw a 10 legacy gets it over. So well a 10 legacy gets you are. Oh, tea, same day, Julian Coran Corancho daughter you are. Chatiko joined the same day. 류다 가가 주도자 류기 미 소화데 류디게 셈기 때 심하도도 미 소화데 가가 나와 가가 예도 거라 셈데 참참무 체제야 셴다고 더제 서라치ля 류드비 차네야 지도 용용 거라 어디인데 가서라 겨치마 예메 타 마주네 고쳐셔버데 제보고네데 다른 무슨도 요한데 체들려 해도 Tila Geshe Yeshe Mahabana Tendamiti, Tawadunga de Mahabana Yongyore, Tishegora, or Tange Mandaso, Ya Tichilana.
So, some have this thought. I mean, all of us recognize that we are going to die. There's some sort of a recognition of that, but most of the time we get caught up in the present, in what's happening right now, the things that we want or the things that we want to avoid. And so it's difficult for us even to think about like 50, 60 years into the future and having a concern about that future happiness and suffering, right? Because what we see directly are the kind of experiences that we are going through now, the sort of happiness that we experience, the suffering that we experience. And that seems to be so important. And so here, if there is a future life or not, some aren't really sure if there is or not. I mean, and some people concluding that, oh, they're definitely not future lives, sort of like the Lokayatas, or those that are only concerned, the kind of hedonists, one could say, don't think about karma, don't think about virtue and non-virtue, and just say, well, do what makes you happy. Enjoy as much as you can, because there's nothing that is going to come beyond this life. And those that say that there is something beyond this, those kind of scholars are really just tricking you to try to make you do something. But here, if we recognize that the Dharma practice of engaging in not harming others, in trying to generate love and compassion and benefit others, that's not about some sort of tricking you, but rather those kinds of practices of Dharma will have an impact right now. You will be happier, those around you will be happier. And so that's Dharma, even if you maybe haven't decided completely whether there are past and future lives, whether there's a future life that you're going to go to. It's not as though this is some kind of a deception, but rather you will be happier. You will experience less suffering the more that you are able to cultivate this kind of attitude of not harming others and trying to benefit them, showing love and compassion. You will experience less suffering now. You and others around you will be happier. Whereas if you engage in your afflictions, getting angry, having a lot of desire and jealousy and pride and so forth, there will be suffering that you experience as a result of that right now. And so if there are not future lives, well, you're not losing out somehow, right? You are still making yourselves happier now. But if there are future lives, then you are creating both a good result in the present as well as a good ripening result in the future. And so when we think about the kind of continuity of phenomena, we have our body, and that acts as a support for the mind, and at death that separates. But it's not as though the mind becomes non-existent, but in the same way that external things, when we look outside around us at rocks and stones and mountains and flowers and so forth, there is a continuity to even those atoms, right? Atoms may change state and so forth, but they don't become non-existent. We have a flower that has a kind of continuity. We can see this in the fact that, like, for example, animals that died long ago, some of their skulls and bones and so forth are preserved. Some go on and become other things, but there is a continuity. And so too, there's a continuity to mind. It is the case that there comes a point in which the body can no longer act as the support for the mind and the feelings and so forth. And at that point, those separate. Our body will, the atoms, material atoms that comprise that, will go on to be other things. And so too, our mind, the very subtle mind, will continue on. And that is going to take another rebirth, right? So here, recognizing that the Dharma practice really of being non-harmful and benefiting others is something that brings good results in the now, regardless of whether there are future lives or not. And it is something that can potentially bring about those kinds of good ripening results in the future as well.
Oh yeah, oh the Lucasura. Whereas Chitako Messiti Dewa Dollar Chiviordo. Levera Carchane, Saya Toya Koya, Tangila Soba Mana, Kangi or Tungi or Timea to the Levachivara. So Kotungelia Luigi Tunga, the Semjitungas in Yoguda. Semjitunga, the Samutanda, Dima de Shana Luigi Tunga, the Saya Mechaya, Tati, Chilo Penjo, Yoma utility and the Kangi Yoguda. The Semjitunga, the Tikanga Mabachi, so the Samutan Joke, the Yunguara. So Nambe Church and the Karla Gueras and Samutanda, Churchuta Laguara. Sem dewa se to te ba che me ja kyo phu so rang sem ne yo so de den sai sem le kyur ju dan sem kyong bo de nga je cha do den sem me le thong ju che da ro e chwa che da te sem nyam ba tu ma nyo ru tong se sem sang bo de ma ru tong se Tende tanya ngara zu nyemba tsama pe thar chimba maya sha, rwa. Ane sangbu tsama de thar chimba ya sanje kuma ngara zu sem de tsa chimba shibachi yo re se, rwa. Sem jirang shi yo se de tumana lupu rwa se. Sem de le gyurju tana tanya yo bache ko, sem de kondu rang shi ma re, kondu de kawan rwa yo re se. O tili ya gyurju tana sosu semba kiba yungo ra. Chi penjo ke tunjian tsang, samlu tangdang dina ane naa de yakbu che, metsi di kibu che ge to ra. Chi penjo kyang kyang samlu tang, sem de nga je trado da chi, chokshi tang tongjo da tanda se, sosu semba kibu memu ngu sum to kudo nga tse. Ngu sum tse tu ra. Penjo kyang kyang ina to ko chubu to kibu shiba che yo ko re te, chubu kibu yo ma re. Saya tunga de paa tadi inda ko yi ki re te, sem de de khonzu maa re chi yo ra, tanda samlu tang maa shi na. Samlutan shena tira, tinte. So de samlutan da labki wara. Semte pe yaguchi wara, yar sana turtana. Tinte nga zu junjuna lungudo, kamsum na semlen jikba shenga mes. Shena de suli shegura, mi semle shegura, samlutan da. Etan bamle shegura, lakza le shegura, lakza mi sogi wara. Etan bam mi sogi wara. Tite semke samlutan ngenpa che, che ne, ene sogi wara. Semte yaguchi duye ne lunga choba ta te yaga yungu wara. Ni chiru lega te yaga rundu wara. Sem ngenpa ene ne raha ngenpa chisu me ngenpa su kanga. Tende chide ngone be kamsu na susu semle chikpa shenka me sede. Sem samlu tangta te yagbu gyurchi tangu wara. Te yaga rabu chewa ene ya ishin nonde semle cha chalo se susu semle susu cha chaya tende shekitwa. Semte yaguchi duye ne raha kiba semle teni lunga choba te sangru dora. Ni shen kiba. O ti indu semje tamze le sanje ji ri yu se. Kyo tamze ta ruya ta yonde tamze ta denpa chiya ka ri yu re se. O tinde chidi ngara zu ti yon misibira tinde marwa. Tinde imba tu susu nyamyo to na haku re se go re. Sobari ji komje to zi chi to na chida. To zi ngima ta mida kondu chunga do ate kungu sum du go re. O tai shida komna ya re ruya chi re se re samsa. Susu nyamyo to na haku tu go ra. Ya ta di chila na mandas.
So here in general, we strive for our happiness, right? If we are lacking the kind of material conditions, if we lack food and conducive conditions for our survival, that is going to create suffering. But here, when we think about the kind of suffering and happiness that we have the suffering of both body and mind. And while lacking those kinds of good conditions can lead to physical suffering, our mental suffering is largely the kind that we create with our own mind, right? And so the kind of suffering that we generate through our mind is something that we can transform by sort of transforming this unruly, this sort of demon of our mind by working too, as it says, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So to subdue the mind is really about increasing our positive, our good thoughts and getting rid of those kinds of negative thoughts that increase our suffering, that create our suffering. And so this is something that our mind has a great potential. As it's said, the nature of mind is clear light, and the kind of afflictions are adventitious. They aren't part of the nature of mind. It's not as though anger is in the nature of our mind. And so if we have this kind of understanding, then say we have the kind of external wealth that we need to not be impoverished, to not experience intense physical suffering, and the right way of thinking, well, then we will really be happy. But it's not as though happiness can come from just having that kind of external wealth. If that were the case, then all rich people would be quite happy. And we can see that that's not the case. Actually, for some, having an increase in their wealth increases the kind of mental suffering and concerns that they experience. And so when we think about the source of actual happiness, it is one that comes through the transformation of our mind. As Shantideva has said in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, there's nothing scarier than the mind. If we are to fear something, it should be to fear the mind. Although we might think like, oh, the kind of weapons that humans create, the kind of things like an atom bomb, we should be afraid of that. Well, where did that come from? That came from the mind of beings. And so if our mind is negative, it has incredible potential to create suffering and harm. And so we need to use our mind in the proper sort of way. We need to take control of it and come to transform it. Because on the other hand, this mind is like a wish-fulfilling jewel. We have the capacity to transform our mind for the better, to actually develop good qualities all the way up until Buddhahood, in their culmination in Buddhahood. And so, as it is said, we all have this kind of Buddha nature. We all have the potential to become a fully enlightened Buddha. It's a matter of developing and increasing those good qualities until we bring them to the state of their culmination. And so every single sentient being has that kind of capacity. And this is something that we can really establish for ourselves based upon our understanding of our own mind and the power of habituation. Like, for example, if we begin to practice patience, we can see that it increases more and more. Our mind has that kind of capacity to develop qualities more and more. And if we actually understand that, then we can see our mind as being a wish-fulfilling jewel. It can become that for us rather than something that we need to fear the most.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's it. Oh, the in the number that one is general. So, the water to me said, so, less on a wage. Go some be some samlutanda, Lunga get Jobacheta, the Sangel Teneco, in Debusanga de Yungudesigora. They are called Lechum Desegate, Cachete, John Amasasha, but the day. Chita le Sambuchena, Sambu Yonata, Lang and Bachena, Debu Namba Yonata, said Dele, Musum to Toya Yesera, Musum to Toto Gudesigora. Marazu Cendile, Tayache, Cabo de Mato. Kashe Cendile ko lega yabuche tambune yabu lopchon che yabuche de ko yabuchira de yora. Kashe tambune ko ngebal ko de te drebu tu go yora yora. Ti rig de la kashe tongju nyunju se sedele sa ne le sambuche ne sambu de ya yoba le ngebache ne ngebar ya yoba. Ti nga jungo su to de yora. Le les de le chebache ta kane ke je sheda semdi samurta da kanga te le ta de yora. O ti de ko le sangel tene trebu titu yoya te chendele ngusum du tu ye chera ta mangbo che kya nga ma nam samba da trash tawa de kale kabure she dire te ina chida le sambu chene trebu sambu ta tinde ngobo kanga le kyu ye se gara kyu de shanda che wang do che me se so ma ba titu ki kyu de so le ra le gre se gara ngai titu te mi shanda che la kwa le na ni nya ga chim shi da ra che ke yo ma ro 소소 마음 봐야 돼. 소디 소소 라고리요 돼서라. 가가리 주요래. 주요인데 저와 지망에 손을 매게 사다 밀게 돼 가르쳐래. 주요래. 미게 와주디 봐. 융아 예수 기권에 미게 와주디 봐. 개와주디 좀나. 티 교대 내손을 맞게 사다 밀게 주래. 다 겨왕만에 사셔네 тел에 대바치제 샤톰 전에 다안줘요라. 티 교대가 좀 두고요래. 지나시 사람이 깨워라야 동해 요래서 기분 중에 삼을 거서나 말 코알에 타라치고서 레다 녀몸베 샤와도 주네 풍분 돌레 제거 같아 소소 라메서 겨왕아만 남서 사베 레게들 때네 풍분 돌레 제거 신제들 할게네 밀게네 내가 상해 지레 마도 그 풀고 강가 강에 지레 되어라 딜레 타라치 딜레 주요래서라 네 가르스도다 나르진세데 담보 ngao nyambe rao ya nga zimbate. Tele tene ni nga se chakbe yu shuk chibu shibu shasara. Ene nga ye sera lu pe chasada soso kwe charo chile shenja kesa shuk chibu shasara. Ne teta tima tu se pe charo pocho de kapdu chasa kondo sasada nyamba che kusa shiru chi shasara. Tele tene ti samlu shawa tu chune ene chatangu le dame dasane kwa kubyora. Koa Korea ku Juyoris, Judiris, Dipakana, and the Katukuris. Tameba, the Tobanita said, Chabada, Nisha Shida. 심지어 탐지가 되는 두두가 사제 사제 두고 나시 교육에서 연대 군대 줄줄 요래서 티 교회에 가려서 교 가려서 다다 받은 거라서 소소 깨치슈지네 저 도마 매번에 뒤왕게 전에 아니 저다다 강가 요한테 거래서 다 삼로 거라 잡을 잡고 다 셔져서도 소소 깨치슈지네 야가 요한에 다저 저 도마 매번에 지대로 다 다저도 야고 쉬차 공개를 지어라 대차요 말마 도르도르시도 요래 근데 셴 깨쳐왔지 그잖아 셴 쪼지 그래서 소소 충주지 우리 개충주지 그자 딱셴 지어왔어 야 나라도 삼르단데 소소 대원들에 동해면들에 디나시 미사마 심제 성마tin데 레아 섬 소알레 거라 소소 강엔 세데 바나시 셴다도 강에 세 자래서 tin데 삼르단데 소소 레가 강가데 셴데 던달 셴도 요래 셴레 펜바트에 소소 펜바트에 나시레도 소소 랭게데도 거라 저 다게 셴시 바스 강가 레가 처음 탐지 Shimba Tsudu Soba Sabdela Soba Kanga Shangi to Konan Ba Shagora. Or teaching any Shandu Tarshiba to Sagi Chumden de Debe. Komatoya Yores, Kibu Chimbu Samlute Ko, Tas Tumde She Marwa, Samlu Chutan and the Red Regiora, De Judisana, Debuti Yungudes, or Tendesian or to send the Kibu Chung and doing the Chimbu Sama Lam de Shagiora. Or the Inditabu Sambu Samlutanera. 심지어 탐지가 또 통계 깨고서 연대 군대지 가사실을 주어차기 섬 이런 무섬을 따오라 세질 뇌질을 상계했을 텐데 새도 요르대 다들 알아줬다 올라가보래 가시 요요 시그라 시부지 배티요나 뒤에배 이런 섬을 따 가시래 뒤에 배잖아 요것도 미 강신세 어떤데 티셔츠네 티셔츠네 중에 티마오방에 받지 토구에 삼사르치 삼루 좀 봐줘 땅고야 Dile tanda lobge yinsa, tanda dil lobto, tatine dil lobge dil tezolange lobge yinsam, lo jajesa. Tanda nashi je tabaris tu tegin sam jumedwa. Tanda nga dimato tugmo, tanga jaje ni tida tikanga lobge yinsam sa samluken. Misam se de pendewa medayora, lo kombeche su chensara. Kacha yaga dil kacha yar ndwa de karesine kombache yatere. Kumdi chesana yar ndwa tachure, samji yende kanga. Rangi ringde ko kombali tene ni yar dura. Chambada so tabaris ti komde te yar de tache sara. O te inde tinde samul tache. Ro kibu kasure. Chungu dan ringda shimbu sama lamdo so rimbi chane. Sanje ji koban topne wachi mao bange bado chigi sam so ba tache. Ti trumbi so de jinsa. Yoya mebe so de samul tan yimdo. Ngebado chi yoya yo samul tan. Ti tondale ni chönye gi sam. Tobada samba komberim ji juba chawo jembe kunu setam de sena be penye chimbo dinde setam de samba shus ya this mamula stara hakodo tire.
So here again, the mind is then something that is very powerful, and it is based upon our kind of mind that we then engage in acts of body and speech. So according to the view of Buddhism, everything is causal, right? Good and bad, our happiness and suffering result from causes, from karma. We create karmas that in turn lead to certain results, and some of those results we can see within a single lifetime. I mean, there are karmas that we have created in the past that ripen in this life, and there are actions that we take in this life that will not ripen until future lives. But we can establish that there is this kind of causality by looking at this life alone. When we do things that are good, that leads to good results. When we engage in a way that is negative, that leads to negative results. And so karma, again, is something that our mind is the driver of then our physical and verbal actions, which in turn we can see the results of some of those. Now, there are some that we can't know the full sort of details, the subtleties of all of that karma, but we can recognize that our suffering and happiness is in our own hands. It would be quite frightening if it were the case that that were in somebody else's hands, right? That they were the ones that were going to give us happiness and suffering. But rather, it is the case that we have that capacity to create our own happiness and suffering through the actions that we undertake. So if we take up the kind of practice of abandoning the 10 non-virtues and accomplishing the 10 virtues, then we are able to ensure that we can gain a good rebirth, that we aren't going to fall into the lower realms. And even going beyond that, then we can think about the fact that even if we were to attain a human or a divine kind of a body, we're still within this kind of cycle of suffering, wherein within samsara we have to cast off and take up these contaminated aggregates due to the force of our karma and afflictions. And this too is something that is causal in the same way that the kind of rebirth that we take is based upon our karmas. Our process of taking up and casting off aggregates itself has a cause. It is caused by this kind of initial ignorance, this grasping at an I. And then from that sense of I comes a sense of mine. We hold to like my body, my things, these that are on my side. And we have the clinging to the things that are sort of attractive to us or that we see as being on our side. And then we see the other as being like an enemy. And under the control of that fundamental ignorance, this grasping at a self, we then engage in these various karmas that in turn perpetuate rebirth within samsara. But if we realize selflessness, if we realize emptiness, we are able to eliminate that cause and thereby attain liberation from that cycle of suffering. And so too, going even beyond that, we have the capacity to become a fully enlightened Buddha, like Buddha Shakyamuni, one who has attained all good qualities and eliminated all faults, who is fully able to benefit all sentient beings. And we see that really, if it were, the kind of thing that prevents us from getting there is this self-centered attitude, this self-cherishing attitude. If it were the case that this were something that were really beneficial to us because we've been engaging in it since beginningless time, we should be in a really great position. If it were working for us, that would be great, but it's not actually working. It is detrimental to us. And so by recognizing that this self-cherishing attitude is something that isn't producing some kind of good result, but rather that cherishing others is what can allow us to become a fully enlightened Buddha. It actually, by recognizing first that all other sentient beings are just like me, just the same, and wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer, all of the kind of capacity to become a being who has those good qualities, who has eliminated all faults, we have the capacity to become that by engaging in the practices of generosity and ethics, patience, joyous effort, and so forth. And we have the capacity to become a being who can perfect the aims of others. We shouldn't see this as sort of like a nice story, like, oh yeah, that's great, Buddha Shakyamuni did this in the past, but this is actually based upon reality. We are able to, through our effort, if we make effort in a long-term kind of a way, we need to think long-term. It's not, it's possible that maybe some beings here will attain Buddhahood within this lifetime, but for the most of us, it's a long-term kind of thinking. And we have all of the capacity to be able to do this if we make an effort at it. And this is based upon this sort of capacity of mind. Our mind, again, is something that through habituation can develop good qualities. We can develop both good and bad, but we can also eliminate all of those kinds of faults as they are not intrinsic to the nature of mind. So mind is really incredible in this way. It's not as though we have to think about, again, attaining Buddhahood right here and now, but over the process of the long term, by expanding our kind of vision, we can see that we can increase those kinds of good qualities more and more, our love, our compassion. And this is something that is definite. We don't have to just sort of think that that's, again, a nice sort of story, but this is something that we can establish for ourselves. And we are able to do this by training our minds in first the kind of paths of the being of small scope, the being of middling scope, and finally getting to that of the being of great scope. And so by recognizing that we have all of the potential, all of of the capacity, and it's a matter of making effort over a long period of time, we can really set this as our goal, that may I become a fully enlightened Buddha, one who has attained all good qualities and eliminated all faults, who is able to fully affect the welfare of other sentient beings. And for that purpose, I'm going to train my mind. I'm going to train my mind in the paths of three scopes, and I'm going to listen to this Dharma, and not just listen to it, but really contemplate it, meditate it on it, and effectuate the kinds of activities that will work for the benefit of others. And so setting such a motivation for listening to the teachings, this is something that is greatly beneficial in terms of the results that will arise from our actions. So we should please set a good motivation for listening to the teachings.
당연히 될래서. 저로가 시주시주면도 시주시주된데서라. 다들 말로선 두세. 다단데 내 가르쳐도서나 소화 대화랑 전바가 와서 동해랑 시주바가 와서 지금도 다들이야. 전전에 숨지 될 거봐. 다들 시험 먹지. 다 당부들이셔. 링시바의 사톱자 불러주래 대화네 리기타다 셈기타 등이 코너를 세번드세 다 개불이야서도 링시를 왕의 개불을 소버트를 주라 있나야세 뒤토가 있나야 콜리지의 개부터 사이나 대화들이야 근데 리기타와다 셈기타와 니용그래세 대화들은 니 코너 세버드세 그래 등이 코너 세버드세 개부치 랭시버 톱자 랭시를 왕게 콜리지의 개부터 붙이 톱에 있나야 대화들이야 아니 류지 소화 대화다 셈기 대화 니 코너 세버드세 야 어디줄라면
So here, then picking up in the text from verse 346. And so here, this is really refuting inherently existent objects of attachment or real feelings of pleasure. And then we'll get into refuting inherently existent suffering and so forth. But beginning with the first of these, which is refuting some kind of real feelings of pleasure. It says, even after a wheel-turning monarch attains governance over the whole world with its four continents, pleasure for him is still considered to be only twofold, physical and mental. So again, here he's speaking to the king. And so even a king who is a wheel-turning monarch, who has dominion over the four continents, for him it is still the case that there are only these two, physical feelings of pleasure and suffering, and mental feelings of pleasure.
뭐야 다들에도 가서래 다들이지 뭐지 다 리지디 짜와더라 십주십된데라 리지 소화 대화내서도 코에 리지 소화 대화내 동해 지나 동해 지나 저만 잠시 리지 가서래 리지 소화 대화내 동해 지나 리지 소화 대화내 동해 지네 저봐서 어디 동해에 마 총드랍시 도야 겁려야네 대화디 연구요래 sember 리지 소화 대화내 동해 지나 저만 잠시 sem지다 즉 롬바 잠시 sem진 두시랑 시대 똑배 제보고 sem지 대화세대 sem지 삼로 땅초다 근데 소천이 연구요래 서시래도 다때 가서도서 리지 소화 대화내 동해 지나 저만 잠시 동해에 많이 오르시와 삼라 아니 대회 삼루치 거시 된듯이 온 거래서 저와 가서래 저만 삼래마도 저랑 전부 말해서 동해 중세 수초를 소야 내가 어디래도 동해도 초를 내가 들 아니 대회 삼루께네 야구 총소사 대회 두시끼리 와마도 대화랑 전부 말해서 대화 오네게 다랑가 청이 들어서 말다 랑셈에 대왕원에서 그 말해서 까메데 초르도 다 대화롬네 코랑 소소 소아 대화 발롬는 영대 요래서 그라 동해 중세 숙청을 소야 내가지 소아 심바 요아스도 대화 요아스라 심바 대화랑 셈바 란셈바 심바데 어디 강에 초를 도와들야 대화문에 지임을 삼데 넘게 요래서라 동해 질주지 대화 점도 마도 와서 동해도 또 요르 내가 나네 대화 넘바 삼마도 이제 동해랑 셈바 요자 코알이야 동해대 원에 전에 지워래서 대화대랑 제스모데 말해서라 동해랑 셈바 요자 대화랑 셈바 중세게 매도세 동해대 동해 원에를 시려서라 고에 동해대 대화대 대화랑 셈 원에서 말해서 강에 지존이 팀에베 내급되네 코랑코랑 섬도 답배하고 전소 삼제 놈대를 마도 비대왕원에게 말해서라 야 되지라나
So sorry, I shouldn't have said suffering there, but that there is only really twofold physical and mental pleasure. And here, then turning to verse 347, it says, then a pleasurable physical sensation is just comparatively less pain. Mental pleasure by nature and attitude is just conceptually created. So samsaric pleasures, physical pleasures, are really just the reduction of suffering, right? When suffering has become lesser, we then exaggerate that as being pleasure. So here, it isn't the case that there is actual pleasure. And here, the term is sometimes one that we use in terms of like inherent existence, but this is talking about real within the world. That when our suffering becomes relatively less, the mind is sort of satiated by that, or we have a feeling of satiation and grasp at it as being really pleasure, but it isn't actually a pleasure. It's just a kind of exaggeration of mind, merely a reduction in the suffering that we were experiencing. And so in the world, though, there is real suffering, right? Not inherently existent, but again, real suffering. Whereas when it comes to samsaric pleasure, it's not really pleasure, but rather it is something that is just a little bit of a reduction in our suffering that our mind exaggerates as being pleasurable.
뭐야 다단다 갑될 셔야게 랑셈바 셔야데 랑가 천니지 주바 생각저 각살 셔야셔봐 랑셈바서 랑가 천니 주바 될 셔요 말해서 뭐네게 셔야데 뭐네게 다와데 말해서 뭐네게 코에 동에데 동에 뭐네래서 대화데 대화 뭐네 매베서시 강에 지 총으로 셔야 내가 소소 넘어마도 말해서 셔기도 뒤에 그 대외 교대고 가서라 강에 저 총으로 줘야 나네 대외 로데 커도대 게 마도야 대외 교대 다가 여나야 대화도 다가 되게요 말해 세상로 맞sam시거라 그 당부 강에 총으로 되고 소화 총으라 답에 야부래서 삼겨라 다들 강에 총으로 들어가래 돼야 다가 되게 말해 또 손에 예도 그 매사라 그 대외 교랑 제바이네 단다 대고라 되게면 도셔라 다 코에 동해랑 쳔바를 샤스 그냥 거르시 나게나 고 나는 나나 봐도 그 나다 그래도 땅고 나서 스파루실 그 나서 매우 샤던데 셔요 말아 나서 때때 봐도 동해 대요라 자 코에 동해 원에를 그 동해 규디까지 대베이나 다가 동해 용거라 코에 대화대 다게 강에 총으로 내가 나 홉티컬 또 저가 그 대화를 서로 마도 야트네 저 서로 말이야. 대 중원에 게르면 도서라. 강에 총을 씹었다 롬바섬을 샤시거라. 어디지 람나?
So here it's important to be clear that when we're referring to this as like ultimate or really pleasure, this is the same kind of rangtsempa that it is often used for the object of negation, but here it's not referring to that kind of the object of negation existence by means of its own characteristics, but really within samsara, it is the case that we don't have real pleasure, as in it's just the reduction of suffering that we exaggerate as being pleasure. It's like if the kind of suffering that we are experiencing is reduced some due to a particular cause, we think like, oh yeah, this is nice, but it's not as though that remains. It disappears. That kind of happiness is just fleeting. Whereas when it comes to suffering, we have real suffering, right? As long as we have a headache, that headache is going to be suffering. It's not the same sort of situation as with pleasure, wherein it is a case of there being a kind of reduction temporarily in the suffering that we were experiencing, and our mind takes that as being pleasurable. It inflates that or exaggerates it to be pleasurable, but rather there is real suffering within samsara, whereas there's not real pleasure.
Oh, yeah. That is that in the Oh, 동해 지주바 삼로 샤워 세드시라. 가도 응원보네 세벌나 트리자 세보다 트리자 공원봉원보라시 되기도 알로께 왔다. 소아동에니 대화 수초에 내급을 샤고 말해서 그래 동행원에 라께 되게 동해 규디 봐도 소아 동해여라. 그래서 대화 대회 내급을 샤 메고 봐라. 동해 줄로 끼그레셔라. 소아 동해 여라 정부라 또도 통로 통로로 겨와다 동해 수 초에 내급지 중세 선바고 소아 선버냐 대나를 끼그라 나와라 대회로 겨버 세도스 어디질렀나.
So here it gives, and this is in the commentary, a kind of explanation that if you have the colors blue and yellow and so forth arranged, this color, like you only give rise to the mind apprehending blue, not the kind of mind apprehending yellow. So too, when it comes to our feelings of suffering, it isn't the case that those are posited on the occasion when our happiness has been reduced. We can have the mind that feels suffering without that kind of relative reduction in our happiness. That's what it's getting at with saying there is real suffering. However, when it comes to our feelings of pleasure, in the same, like, when it comes to our feelings of pleasure, in the same way that, like, when we posit long independence upon short, it is when the mind feels like there's sort of this appearance of there being some kind of satiation because of a reduction of suffering that we give rise to a feeling of it being pleasurable.
Oh, yeah. The Shigebanal Saviors the Shigebanal the Pechan Shadwa, Langa the Dr. Kitchen do you know? Dr. Kashi Pumbekan Kigdo, Digan Kigdo. Other Pumba de Sudan Nasuna, I could take a cash, the Jode Supena, the Vena Shagada, or Tayabuchos, Lily Shara. Daughter, Yina could decalate the mail shasa, they she never go to Sanko, Tayabuchos San. So at the Vena Kigara, but the Tawagamari, Tagicale, the church in the neg of the Cote Lomba de Segara. Oh, Tanashi. Tinashi Lamgara Jodone. Ya Tawara Chine. Tawashi Chasuna, Tamu Sajil Shasuna, the Velo Kigra, Tape of Chosum. Tate Tawa Mune Ransem Marisara. Tagi Tawachi de Gange de Machoris, the Telia Tawa Lomba de Sara. Tamune Tawa in the Tanda Kazatena saw Dewa Dagora. Tite Mare. Parujil Khan should Tana saw you such a left sign Yakayota Sera. Some good at it. But in the co, they were on somebody Medusa. They were on somebody net the duty Tagadena. They were on there with the take Medusa. To me, Jusiana, Goras and Nazareth, Chichuna, Nazar, Madrabada, to me the Yadera. Music Chinyata, Nazar Dera. To me, Judy, to me, Junga, couldn't Judy, you but to me the take to Sera. What is you love? And dig door, yeah.
So here, this is also explained in Aryadeva's 400 verses, like in the way that if you're carrying something along the road and say you have it on this shoulder initially, you're like carrying a bag over that shoulder and it gets really tired. And so you shift it to your other shoulder. Well, you're going to feel like, oh, that's pleasurable, right? Like, oh, this is nice. I'm getting relief. Well, it's really just, again, a reduction in that suffering that we are exaggerating as being pleasure. But there's not really a true pleasure there. And so too, like if we're walking along a road and we get really, really hot and we go and sit in somewhere that is cool, we think, oh yeah, this is a pleasurable experience because we think that it is pleasurable, but it's really just a reduction in that suffering of heat. Again, we'll eventually feel cold and then feel like, oh, I need to go seek out somewhere that's hot. So it's not the case that as long as we are relying on that cause, we are going to experience pleasure. If it were the case that there were real, true pleasure, then as long as we rely upon that particular cause, like going and sitting in a cool place, we would have to experience pleasure from that. But we can see that that's not the case. Whereas when it comes to suffering, so long as the cause of that suffering is there, we are going to experience suffering. If your head is hurting, as long as you have the causes for that, you're going to have a headache. It's going to be suffering. So this again is extensively explained within Aryadeva's 400 verses.
다들 뺏어 세수지들을 말아도 맹가르질래 칼라사마도 뺏어 야 로마도 같이 양제 나서르시나로 다들 내가 다저 수 나랩스나 다 소고도 탄다 여러 전에 현다 가면은 배야고래도 삼체 땡기라 술래네 다들 칼라르제 사야 지금마다 먼저 쳐도 대외 좋아 슈첨부 지거라 다이네 배야고 청수산나다 다 대외 교대 때 나자 자네 나자 매체 단다 때려와 그냥 초를 손로라 이마치 신이 신이 때 지에 단 그때 나자 매나 게레면도 서양 동행 고추 현당 고추로 자 그것도 때때 교인에 때 따와르스 때와도 때때하고 소화도 때 말와 당이 강에 숙청부터 종자 때 예상하는 숙청부터 종하라 대외 초나도 종거도 때때 대원원의 교인나 대외 교문에게 말해서 당이 강에 되어서 tin초를 시자 삼바레스 롬바삼레 소소 삼록 봐주자 소소 류심을 팬베스지 녀아들 대화식도 류다삼을 팬 어따야부 jonso삼 류심을 내베스지 유대 녀아이네 동해서 요라 어디지라냐
So, like to give another kind of clarifying example, if we were to go to a hospital, like when we're really sick, we can't eat, we can't move very much, and so we're so sick, and then we get medical treatment and we're released from the hospital, we think like, oh, this is happiness, this is so pleasurable, and we're able to go home and we're able to eat and so forth. But slowly that starts to disappear, right? We are not going to have that kind of feeling of happiness or pleasure for very long, and soon other sufferings will arise, right? So it seems as though that experience of being cured from whatever illness it was is actually pleasurable, but it's really just a reduction in the kind of suffering that we were experiencing before. It's not actual pleasure, but rather something that is exaggerated by mind. Whereas when it comes to our suffering, that is something that as long as it's there, it's going to remain as suffering. It's not sort of like the kind of fleeting feeling of happiness that we get when we exaggerate a reduction of suffering as being pleasure.
뭐야 다들 메타 다 이나야서도 가서래 초대와 된다잖아요 초코래 초대와 된면도 아세 초대와 통해도 매서고다서 어떤 데 럽죠 말이 다가 초대와 샤고래 셔라 코나 초대와 롬바로 콜레신 펜베서 코나 기부를 줘라 다가 초대와 샤고래 초대와 통해도 매서요 말에서 딜라고래서 야 카시스노 어땡원한테네 콜라 초대와 된면도 아세잖아 통해도 매서서서 디마레서라 초대와 통해도 매도 시고와 되고 매사세 개반에 시접에 나를 요티티 손도 야 틴디버세 네 똑베 동해랑 챵바 예자 대화랑 챵바 매바시바서 어떠들었다 똑베 네 동해랑 챵바 요아데세 똑베 따바스이나 대화랑 챵바 요아마데스 대화 따바와레스 가서 셈이 롬바 삼서라 따바와라 셈메 어떻게 시고라 야 디실람나
So here, though we shouldn't say that it is kind of disparaging pleasurable feelings as saying like even conventionally there's not a feeling of pleasure within samsara. Again, this is one should know this as it is extensively explained from within Aryadeva's 400 verses. However, one should recognize that pleasurable feelings are really just a kind of exaggeration of mind, something that is designated on a reduction of a feeling of suffering. So here, it's not as though we're saying, well, even conventionally, there's no sort of pleasure, but rather it is that that is something imputed, designated by mind, and is merely that. And so, although there is a kind of actual suffering that is designated by mind, there is no actual pleasure. We should recognize that. So here it is important to recognize that it's not sort of disparaging or undermining that there is pleasure within samsara, but it's not real pleasure.
뭐야? 다들 temba se 다들 니바 se 다들 지대 때에 너가 그래서 솔로가 쉽게 되다. 지대 때에 너가 그 동해 지네 쇼삼다 동해리아 대화로 버쳐 삼데스. 지대 때와 너가 그 지대네야 대화세 당연 너가 대 삼마시고라. 동해 지네 줘봐서 동해 초로 내가 우리 안에 sembiolo basam segara. Tokpa tsam yi desir, tene tendo teme dosa, tene kasi dosana, jiden tewan dokpa kun tunge chini chio basam da, tokpa ke pa, tokpa tsam yi imbesir, tewa lo basam imbesir, tewa tene tendo tewa ranchenpa me dosira, yo maresa, wati chilamna.
So then, turning to the verse 348, which is then says, since it is just comparatively less pain or merely conceptually created, all the pleasure in the world is ultimately not really pleasure. So what we call pleasurable feelings within the world, all of those things that exist are merely, again, a reduction in suffering. And they are things that are merely conceptually designated, as in they are exaggerations of that reduction in suffering as being pleasurable. And thereby we can say that in actuality, there is no real pleasure.
뭐야, 다스 봐, 쉐바스. 쉐발의 니시아 sabjetiredo. Dewaran sembe tupsi kagwas. Da dewaran sembe yebe tupsi kagwasira. Ane ngo kagwas. Da tambo ani dewaran sembe yebe tupsi kagwatani. Yiji dewaran sembe tupsi kag. Yiji dewaran sembe yese te tupsi sitambiora te baka. Liji dewaran sembe yore te tupsi kagwani tuwa. Da tambo nisa. Ya karşıvrısına. Lüji tungeran sembe tupsi kagwatira. Te karşıdosuna. Yiji tawaran sembe tupsi kagwa, lüji tawaran sembe. Da yiji tawaran sembe tupsi kagwa derida. Yiji tawaran sembe yode. Te kebe kyuwonju yebe chir. Da shen topa kuyora. Yiji tawaran sembe me seti drigme dosi. Yiji tawaran sembe yode ese. Karesine. Te kebe wonju ta yebe chir. Te kebe kyura. Dan jiden cheba bu kele gere china. Da jawanda chine wonju kele gezu. 사실 원주 근식된 강가 쪽이 알아. 대화도 동해 강가도 되게 교체네 좀 거래서 대 공부시네. 대화 고기도 선도 대화 동해 고기선 되게 왔어라. 대화를 안 잡아 이게 대화를 안 잡아 요래. 대 가래서는 대개배 중원주 협의실. 사실 원주 협의실 대화 경주. 신나서 다들 바꿔게 왔다. 근데 대화 집에 준도 받다. 원이지 대회 규메데 제선도다면 대외 중원에 말해서라 대외 주인이 대화다 제선도다 싶고 그라 뒤에는 대화 중을 땡해봐도 요 공개 뒤에는 대화 민중게 싶고라 대화중원주도 여벨 대화 중만주 대화중원주를 뜨고 말해서라 대외 주신다 신을 뜨고 말도 대화중원주를 뜨고 말해서 그래 ten ring matter. Then I got the Nasa as a chosen. Nasa Tata to the matter, lodging on you, and the lodging on you. So Roger saw at the station a tragura. The tragmara. I'm just telling to do. Give me some trouble. You got to try to do Tata to shoot the matter. Lodging on you, Chimata. Lodging on you, yeah, but some young. I'm just telling Roma water. Kucheroshini Cheshire, Chinimatani Chimara. I'm just on Roma to Keva Megachard. Yeah, what did you learn?
So then we get into the more extensive explanation, which begins with a refutation of the proofs of there being real pleasure. And that is further divided into refuting proofs of real mental pleasure and then of real physical pleasure. And so here, beginning with the kind of refutation of the proofs establishing real mental pleasure, someone might say, and this is going to come in verse 349, but first, someone would say, well, there is a real mental pleasure because the cause for generating that is Indra, for example. And so here, there are those who would assert that there is some kind of creator God that is the cause of all pleasures. Now, in refuting that, it would say that, well, asserting that Indra, for example, is the cause of real pleasure, that's not an acceptable kind of proof of there being real pleasure because it isn't the case that those always follow after. So, for example, if you have this kind of creator God that's always existent, like Indra, for example, it would have to be the case that all of these pleasures that he is the cause of would have to always sort of be existent. But if we take, for example, like when you're sick and you go to a doctor to get cured from that, you don't just propitiate Indra and you're able to be relieved of that. But there are rather other causes and conditions for those kinds of pleasures, or at least, what we designate as pleasure within the world. And so therefore, asserting that something like Indra or some kind of an all-powerful being is the cause of pleasure is not a suitable kind of a proposition.
Oh, the Jason Rota says to us. Jason Rota said that Jebuti, Jutila Jason Rota get out to her. The water don't want you Chambolia, Jason Rota to Marisora. Don't get there, want you Jason Rota to Bura. Jason Rosa Penatuate, me, to a counter Yobater, Meg about Yokura. Me mana, to a young Marwa. Jason Rosa Tira. To a Yosatilla, Meg about Yokura. Me mana, me tambuna mana, till to a young Marwa. To a counter Satilla, to a cutie Yokura, temperature. To a cutie mana, met mana, to a young Marwa, till a Jason Rota to Sigara. The one you da Davalia, Jason Rota to Marisora. Oh, yeah, this is
So here, the last line of the commentary that comes before this verse 349 says that because the sort of forward and reverse, we can say pervasion are not established. So here, it isn't the case that you can establish that this always follows after, or that if there, like for example, if you have smoke, you know that there is fire. Fire follows after smoke, and when there is no fire, then there's going to be no smoke. And so similarly, you can establish that kind of in the absence of that thing, the absence of the cause, there won't be the result. And so too, in this case, their assertion that Indra, for example, is acting as the cause, then that would mean that if he's the cause of pleasure, then there would always be pleasure as long as he is there. And so there is no establishment, or there's no the complete kind of following after the forward and reverse in that case.
Oh, yeah. No, that did it. Tawaterita Karsere. She would it. Linda, you don't need a kimchera. That it the way you know to the shade. Linda, sir, use a little longer of the dirty, linger of the data. Long butcher, nature, Kim Kambacher, Cordans the motor down 6 second that data balance passenger. Choda Danda. Then 땡땡에다 둘러들 둘러거야 그 남다시 근데 매샤 녀제듯이 사예체 동예체 서동 랑부 실라 소바 다다 아 김장에 배매다 개발을 소바 배매 배매 제자 레레세세 되게 자와들다 다 대야 링다 유다 내다 김다 초다 땡다 그남 다 매샤다 서동다 랑부다 다다 배매다 조선부 대다네 롱제자 롱제자 레레세바 다 롱제자 롭지라 첸텐데 요레세 텔테네네 타와케 그레세르세 what did you love now?
So then, coming in the root verse 349, and here it's listing off these things that are causes of worldly pleasures. So it says the continents, countries, places, houses, conveyances. We could think of that as like cars and various ways in which we get from one way to another. Seats, clothing, beds, food, drink, elephants, horses, and women are all enjoyed at distinct points in time. So here, as opposed to there being a kind of a universal cause of pleasure, this is a listing off various objects that are causes of pleasure, that are that give pleasure at distinct times.
오야 다 솔로 강압주더라 압주바다 강제 강라 셈죽바세 대세 대 대세 자스 강게 제 강라 셈죽바 대세 되게 따와 예시 따버려서 하마 일라 메시베 되네 던도 되메도 되메 니사 만데코란 데발로션 주의 강게 제 강야 로아 론초발라 대오냐베 셈중와테 제 대대시 롬바탈스 강래야 론초바테세 라 네 초아 심버리 중에 로중와테세 대와뇨와세 지데나 타바나시스라 대시 롬바탈라세 셈기파 롬바 아니 그래 직롱 쉐제 대오냐베 론중와테세 사마 예라 메시베테세 라마남 텐도 란세 베테베 교를 때문에 바니라 유 망보시 유도 제베이나 고 미게 통해다 다니에다 망보시 유도 제베이나 미게 통해들 미세 똑바근 주는 어때야고 또 선배나 뒤때와 용기를 마도 신다 또 통나야 때와 용도 말해서 그라 똑바된 심지 고도 똑바게 로저제 때오냐베로 로중한테세 상마 일하면서 신다데 똑바 유도 제토 말해 뒤때와 용기 말해서 그라 무슨 게 통하자마다 메시베테에서 라마남 전도 란센 베테웨 큐르 네바니도사 어디 란센 테웨 큐르 란센 바리 마레서 주선보다다 오니게 테웨 큐이나스 다 테웨 큐타텔 주선셰라 테 주선셰바테다 오니게 테웨 큐이나스 거라 네 롱 마제세 마템베세야 대화계를 나세 이것도 주인은 자디나 마데브니나 자디나 소소 대화계 그래서라 자디자게서 터나 마데나 대처리 이 마데나 자디 터나 가서리 이 똑베 대처리 상마다나 대화계 그래서라 그 대화 주인은 로마제제 마템베세야 대화계 버리나 대 매베 치르 아니까 저기 버리나셔 네대 매베 치르다 네유 지금 론초베세 라마 남라 론초바 매베 치르 대다 여바 잠비 대외 줄메르서 때 여바 잠비 대외 줄이 말해서 똑바게 봐야 삼로에 따져 어때 야구도 삼사 이디 대쇼량 도래 텔레 삼 땅거를 마도 현다데 대참게 말해서 그래 야 대실라나
So then, continuing into verse 350, it says, one has pleasure through whichever of these the mind attends to. So there are these like 13 things listed above as being causes of pleasure, and one has pleasure through whichever of these the mind attends to, but one does not attend to the rest. Hence, they are not ultimately causes of pleasures. So whenever one attends to one of those various kind of objects, enjoys that object, there arises the mind that thinks, oh, this is pleasure. But again, this is just, we can understand this as being a kind of exaggeration of that at that time, thinking, oh, this is pleasurable. And when one is enjoying one of those things, one gives rise to this thought of, oh, this is pleasurable. And so if these many causes of pleasure are listed, it is the case that they would have to sort of always bring about pleasure. But we can see that, like, for example, if the visual consciousness apprehends one particular object and doesn't apprehend others, it's rather the mind that designates that as being, oh, this is pleasurable. So here, like, if it were the case that all of these objects were really pleasurable, then even if the mind were not attending to them, were not engaged with them, they would be the cause of pleasure. But here we can see that whatever it is that one is individually enjoying, one then doesn't give mental attention to the rest of those. And at that time, those are not in actuality then the cause of real pleasure. And so if it were the case that these 13 things listed above were really truly like actually the cause of pleasure, then even when you're not enjoying them, not recalling them, it would be logical for them to generate that kind of pleasure. However, that's not the case. It's only the case that we are able to designate something as pleasure based upon what the mind is attending to and what the mind is sort of exaggerating as, oh yes, this is pleasure. So it's not as though just by their very being, it is suitable to say that they are the cause of pleasure.
Oh yeah. 다 류지 대화랑 전부 입에 줍식하고 들어도 유nga 유nga 뒤바테 줍식인 바하고 와시 유nga 수다트를 살아서 유nga 들어 아니 대화랑 전부 입에 줍식인 바하고 레레 줍식인 바하고 니도 nga 줍식인 바하고 레레네 줍식인 바하고 다 담보네 유nga 유nga의 대화 줍식도 뇽데세 다 같이 세워라 유nga의 대화 줍식도 뇽데 가르겐게 수다 링보다 같은 데가 참게르시나 라 가르겐게 수다 링보다 당데 tratin데 용구라 tra다 아가르 쥐다 아가르라서 같은 데 점심부 근데 tekayda 정지로다 고제르상아 고제르사 원봉의 냠수 용어시나 어때 나가데 대화 뒤치도 용야 누아세 근데 나한테 연구를 세나서 커지시거라 다 밀라 속에 원봉에 유가 진짜선 집에서 관계처를 똑바로 매체 대체를 네 대체 때라 대화면서 이대 인지면서 뒤쳐를 또 그래서 삼을 땅 그래서 어디 야구도 삼 근데 삼을 땅이 온 건 뭐지 유가 원본을 차로 잠기 때와 요행해 봐요 말해서 그래 설강을 좀 같이 들으라 제가 패시티인데 이제 로나로서 밀라 속에 원봉에 유가 집에서 대체 대화가 뒤치도 매대에서 요 말을 서로 봐요. 강계체는 똑배 마소나 대화를 메시바 강하셔서 똑바게 삼리 이되게 삼을당으로 이되초 삼을당 그래. 이 삼마다는 또 하고 통말해서 유응하다 대화가 뒤치도 똑바로 메시베셔서 유응하가 뒤치도 근데 대화 요했던데 용말해서 그래. 야
So then next we turn to the refutation of the proofs for real physical pleasure. And this is divided into refuting an aggregation of the five objects as a proof for real physical pleasure, and then refuting the individual objects of the five senses. Here, beginning then in verse 351, this gives a refutation of the kind of refuting the aggregation of those five objects as a proof for real physical pleasure. If you were to experience at one time the five like objects of pleasure, if you were to have like an actor performing, so that would be the form, and then the sound of the vina or an instrument, the smell of like aloe wood or akuru, that smell, as well as like experiencing the taste of honey, and the kind of pleasurable touch of clothing, that would be pleasurable, right? That's sort of what is being proposed. And then in this verse 351, it says, the five sense faculties, such as the eye, do not conceptualize the five kinds of objects that they apprehend. Therefore, at that time, one does not perceive them as pleasant. Here, it's not as though the eye sense power and the other five sense faculties, when they apprehend these five objects at a single time, can have them be pleasurable. And why is that? Well, it's because they're not held by mind. And so whatever is not sort of known or held by mind is then not able to be the cause of pleasure. Here, if one is in sort of indulging in pleasurable objects of the five senses, it's only the case that whatever the mind attends to and conceptualizes as pleasurable will be pleasurable. It's not as though those exist in and of themselves as pleasurable.
야, 강압증 아니더라 서로가. 강제 유니 강다 강서 유 강다 강야. 원부 강다 강게 시버 줄바서. 대세 랑마. 대세 랑마. 대세 랑메 랑마이. 강제 티시르 대미 니사. 다들 가르쳐줬어. 강게 제 소라 소베 유니 강다 강. 원부 강다 강게 시버 줄바 대세 시거라. 대세 원부 랑마 yu lama jimba tela kebe tewa me te ese ta yu kange rwa yi te se tele tewa yore shenda te tewa nyung mari se kange chena te ese yu lama nam tewe tanto mebe sir tewa kebe shile yo mari se ka yi ki ti shola macho se ti semra ya ti chilana.
The next verse, 352, says, when one is aware of one of the five kinds of objects by means of one of the senses, one has no awareness of the remaining kinds of objects by means of the remaining senses, because those remaining objects are not taken as objects at that time. Here, when you have something like at whichever time one it takes the objects of form and so forth, that is what is known by that particular sense consciousness. And so at that time, the other sense faculties don't apprehend the remaining objects. There is no generation of pleasure at that time. Again, as it says, because those remaining objects are not taken as objects at that time. And so therefore they can't be like really pleasurable.
야, 다 솔로가 가중가 숨대라. te 가르쳐줬어. 원부 얘네 미규를 봐서 원부가 유용하지 미규 나야서 대배 유익이 남발라서 대배 유익이 남발라 이익이 미네 이익이 미네 또가 나서 다 이익이 티셔려 삼르다네 소설리신의 펜베스자 네베스지까지면데 이익이 그 절고여라 또가 나 대원냠도 롬버체 네 대화께서 냠도 티치르세 이익이 티셔를 마테나 리신의 펜베스지 삼르마다나네 그 유인 점바이나 대원냠고 말했습니다. 원부 얘네 유 미바리 줄바 란두나 네베 유 Yuji namba yiji mine, tokwa teo nyamdo lombar sheba yin la ase. Gyu chik la tokwa duma chikchar me jiwe chiris. Yu shenda kanga la ya dewa nyon toku maru de. Gyu chik do tokwa rik mitin batin do mabu chiya yo maru shivara. Ya tilo.
So, then in 353, it says, the mind perceives the image of an object that was perceived in the past by the sense faculties. Perceiving it, the mind conceptualizes the image and believes it to be pleasant. So it follows that when it comes to our perceiving objects, our sense faculties actually observe objects that have already passed. So when the mind conceptualizes those objects or takes those as an object, it is merely sort of exaggerating the pleasure on the basis of that. And it's not possible again, when we view something as either being beneficial to us or harmful to us, it's not the case that our conceptual thought can, in a single continuum, give rise to multiple concepts at a single same time.
Waleso. Yu lama nam tewe tondo meba nyuchi. Solo ka ngabju nga sondirwa.
Ngapshungashidi.
Nga sondirwa.
Ngapsumdi drosasa.
Chasongre.
Oh.
Tata lombar stetisa. Dandisha, nipala nisa. Muta tujo, dandido. Ya, dandido. Ngabju nga shidira.
Nare.
Ine wambo chiki ne. Tenchik sheba kanyin bas. Teya teme par teme. Teya teme par teme. Tati karsido sana. Ngabju nga shidira. Jitena mikdabi wambo chiki isikidwa. Jitena mikdabi wambo chiki isa. Wambo chiki ne. Dini wambo chiki ne se. Tenchik sheba kanyin basikidwa. Wambo chiki ne sutabi tenchik sheba kanyin bataya. Suji ten me bara. Suji ten me bara. Miwangi ten me ba ten me la. Miwangi ten me la. Suji ten ya. Miwante me bara. Ten me ba ala chidi mena chidi kaya tanda sang marisi gara. Dine wangbu chigi ne tenji shiba kanyin ba. Tenya ten me par ten me. Tenya ten me par ten me se. Karsido jiden dinas. Migdabi wangbu chigi ne sutabi tenchik shiba kanyin ba teya se. Suji ten me bara. Miwangi ten me la. Sudi mena ne miwangi ten chitu mato. Suji ten ya miwangi me bara. Ten me be se. De sudi zimbal miwangi mena ten me be. Tenchi te be chirsa. Miwangi ta su ta. Tetu te ne ni namshi kiya kora. Tenchi te be chir. Ngonyi ji me na se. Te me be. Luji te wa ransenpa me to se. Ta rangshin ki kiwa. Ngonyi ji kiwa. Ransenpa me to se. Ya tishi lamna. Luji.
So then, second is a refutation of the proof of the individual objects being the sort of real physical pleasure. And there's the actual and then the refutation of that proof. And so here in verse 354, it reads, a single sense faculty knows a single kind of object, but without that object, it is not really a sense faculty. And without that sense faculty, the object is not really an object. So here in this world, if we take like the single, like the eye faculty, for example, it knows a single kind of an object, like a form, for example. But if it is lacking a form, then it's meaningless to speak about an eye sense faculty, right? These are mutually contingent, mutually posited upon one another. So here, it continues by saying, that again, like in the absence of there being an actual form, then we can't, it is, when there is a form, sorry, then it is not meaningless to talk about the visual sense faculty, again, because these are mutually contingent. And so here it is the case that, again, there's no real pleasure in that these two are mutually dependent upon one another.
Oh, yeah. 다들 전자를 가시도와 남세랑 신지 주바가 와시도와 근데 유랑 신지 주바가 원보랑 신지 주바가 다 빠져요구나 다 담보 유 원보 라겐을 유대해서 가지라고도 담보네 유다 원보 라겐을 유대 된 대부 남세 유베셔스 다 라겐을 주바케는 게 좋대라고라 유다 원보 사면에 주바 유대 된 대부 남식 되는 베치르셔나 지출라고도 다들 대파 가비지 지달 파다 마다라 때내 보낸 중시해봐 대신 메다 수 때내 넘버 7번 중을 쉐스 다 가르쳐도서나 지달 파다 마다라 때내 보낸 중을 쉐봐 대신 도스 메다 수라 때내 넘버 7번 중을 쉐봐 넘버 7 랑신기 매대에서 랑신기 남시대 랑신기 매다 술라 때베시 다게 메와다 메게 술라 때니 케쿠이도고 랑신기 요나 샬라 때메도 케쿠야라 코라 랑신기 와라 랑웨네 와라 코랑 회네 와라스네 샬라 때신 데메고 바시 쿠야라 어디래도 가서 메다 술라 때베시 페나 하마다 부신노세 땡진 레버리존 예비치시 땡진 티르서라 남시랑 시기메데 미다 술라 땡진 레버리존 예비치시 미다 술라 땡진 레버리존 예비치시면 야 어디질라나
So then next, the actual sort of refutation of that proof then comes in 3 points that will come as we go throughout. That is refuting inherently existing consciousness, refuting inherently existing objects, and refuting inherently existent senses. And so here, the first of these is then it comes in verse 335, which is a refutation of inherently established consciousness. And so here, if one is to say that, well, the object and the sense powers exist by means of their own kind of essence, and therefore the result of those is consciousness, well, again, here, those that would assert that there's some sort of objective, independent existence to these objects, those that would say that there is this kind of objective existence, this is then being refuted in this verse where it says, just as a child comes into existence in dependence upon his or her parents, so too visual awareness is said to arise in dependence upon the eye and a visual form. So in the same way that it is only with the existence of a mother and a father that we can assert there is a child, right? There can be the coming about of a child. So too, it is in dependence upon the eye sense faculty and form that we can talk about there being the arising of visual consciousness. And so there's no inherently existent visual consciousness. If it were the case that there were, it wouldn't have to be dependent upon the kind of dominant condition in terms of the eye sense power or the sort of objective condition of there being a form. And so here we can refute that kind of inherent existence of the visual consciousness or of consciousness because it is dependent upon the eye and the form. Like, for example, how it is that a child is dependent upon their mother and father. And so this is the kind of reasoning of dependent origination that is being used here.
야 다들다 유다 원부 랑게 뭐에 유대 때 대부 예비치르서다야 뭐 마와서 뭐부 템바트바 켈랭게 줘라 유다 원부 랑게 뭐에 유대 때 대부 남식 예비치르서다 다 텔레파 데 짜와시도와 지다르 파다 마다라 때내 보내 중세바 Tishi Mida Sutene, number Sheba Juma Shares, Sholokachi Dova, or the Keva Kashasane, Savashirab Gishunde, some Giores, Titsashi Shuma Rese, or Tishida. Chitarpata Mata Latene Juma Sheba, Tishin to Mita Su Latene, number Sheba Juma Sheba, number Sheba, Ranshinki Mede, Mita Sula Teviser, Pena, Pada Mata Latene Juma Shindose. Bin tanda driswa, tanda tsuche desi wara tama tsuche dira, loben dawa chakwa tsukse to chang shaas wara, tsukse nal long di chang shaas. Ti indi kheba khashasana ti tsashi long re sam shaas wara, chang ba chanse ki sheba shi, chanse nga ki kheba chanse se wara, o ti sheba chingi khashe ti tsashi long iba shisha chi chang shaas, ti tsashi long ma re se. Ti tanda ti tsashi long ina tsashi tsikche, 시계다 시주 시구 요새 자가 개발하고 주제 장가 교육서라 사와시를 주제 그저스네 주제 십개 십주 시구 요새 자가 개발하지 근자봐 당연 계획 처리서 뒤지러서 야 뒤지라는
So here again, coming in the commentary prior to this verse, as those sort of realists would assert, they would say that, well, the object and the faculty are existent, objectively existent, and so therefore the resulting consciousness is also objectively existent. And here then the verse that follows again says, just as a child comes into existence in dependence upon his or her parents, so too visual awareness is said to arise in dependence upon the eye and a visible form. And so here this is using the kind of reasoning of dependent origination to establish that, well, the visual consciousness or awareness is not inherently existent because it arises contingent upon the eye and a form, like how, for example, a child arises in dependence upon a mother and a father. And so here, this verse 355, some mistakenly attribute this to the root verses on wisdom by Nagarjuna, as quoted within Chandrakirti's clear words. And so this is a misattribution in terms of where this verse is coming from. Some assert that this verse is part of that text. And if it were like that, then it would contradict those scholars who have counted up the verses of the fundamental verses on wisdom, or those root verses that number 449. And so here we should understand that this is from this text here, not as it is sometimes mistakenly attributed to be from the root verses on wisdom.
Oh yeah. 더 순반에서 대바타 마오바남 왕보다 제바 저메라 가시라 알레 또마드로다 남시랑시 기회에 다 같이 찍으시다 뭐뭐 남시 남시랑시 기회에 대유유베 찍으시거라 남시랑시 기회에 남시랑시 기회에 대유수다 들으려고 소바 유베 찍으시거라 다 텔바 가르쳐도서 유는 대다 마오남 왕보다시 더메라스 진이 레타 때메처 강다 다다르양 때메서 어때 참아 랑신기 메서요라 가르쳐도서나 유는 대다 마오남 왕보다시 봐 더메서 랑은에 두베 더메서요라 벨라 진이 타데 진이 레타 타데메 진이 레타 타데시 아니 가래 강다 다다르양 때메서 어들 다데 가르쳐도서나 유니 대바다 마오바 남시다 셰바 각바다 마오 마토베치 각바선 대바서라 마토바 마오바서도 근데 대 마오니라네 대 마오 드니라네 대 마오 드니라네 만데베 랑신기 meba tatarwa de mao gituna mena tatawa ten de mao gituna mena sa rangi de mao gituna rani mena sa gona mena tenila mete bartal tebesir ore tenila mete bartal la se la mendro samchadwa dit tende takuere sa te kasira parma shanta changbarta amde parta sutana pecha kashana de thala se to de mao ge tuna mena tenila mete bar thalas ane mete bar thala la tenila tebesir de mao mengenge ngobuchi ngumarwa tenila tebesir teni je tuna yebarta dona teni tuna yebarta this was thalas inane digdwa thalas che mato che de tebumedwa tenila mete bar thal tebesir serse mete bar thal tebesir na mete bar thalas pecha khashana tidishto la jamna tachura tenila de mao la mete bar thagre ese ten de marese de mao la ngeba de teguras de mao menge ngobashi ngumarase ora teni je tuna yebarta dona tadawa de mao nile tadedo tuba mebecher omboda chebe de mela gang tadaya de mebe namse ran shinji tuba meto ose namse tadarwa yu tadarwa zimbe omboda tani ran shinji yu chena ya o tibado chilamna de mese tibado lana ran shinji tuba de meto ose.
So then next, we have in 356 here, it says, again, this is a refutation of the object as being inherently established. And so here one says, well, the awareness or consciousness is inherently established because its objects exist. Well, if you are to say that, then it says here in verse 356, past and future objects are unreal, and so are past and future faculties. Present ones are not distinct from these two, past and future ones. Hence, the present ones are also unreal. So here, when it comes to objects, those that are of the past and those that are of the future, again, together with their consciousness, are either past, right? They are sort of passed by, or they do not yet exist in terms of future objects. So here, in terms of the past and the future, both of those, in the same way that they are not inherently existent, then here, if the present, this present then as well, is not existent in the past or the future. And here it is, again, because it is not just sort of contingent upon those two. If you were to say it would follow that that's because it's not contingent upon those two. Well, that's not correct. It is contingent upon those two. Now here in the Tibetan, it has this part where it says it follows that it would not be contingent or dependent, and that should be followed by the ladun syllable that makes this then grammatically correct. I think that is in some of the texts, and then it says it would follow that they would not be contingent, and then it follows that with, well, because they are contingent. So here, it would follow that it would exist at those two times. And so if you assert that, then that would establish that the present is no different from the past and the future. And so here one would have to say that similar to past and future objects, which are contingent, so too then the present, because, and together with the sort of sense faculty that comes with that, would also also become like not have any sort of meaning. And so here, this is because they are not inherently established. So again, as it says, like the present objects are not distinct from these past and future ones, in the sense that the present one is also contingent. It is contingent upon the faculty and so forth. And so here again, the kind of present is not inherently existent, and it follows that the consciousness is then not inherently existent.
오야. 오다 돈도 디 텐주 루시샤르와. 텐주 루시샤치도 랑신기 여세다. 랑윈에 여바세다. 랑게 챙이지 여바세다. 돈 담바르 여바세다. 추뚝도 여바세다. 저쪽 간가 집어도 거라. 디 시랑 예비나서 최탐제 랑신기 돈바 남바야 다바치 스타오선 거다. 자 랑신기 여세도 땡전 데르네 코랑 오샤 메고르스 건도야라. 코라 랑신기 여세 코라 랑신기 랑게 고여요래. 코라 랑신기 요래. 랑게 고여요래. 랑윈에 요래. 로 코라 윈에 추요나. 현달에 뜻이 되네 코고 오샤 메고르스 건도다. 자 랑윈에 요봐. 랑신기 요봐. 랑게 고여요봐. 랑레 요봐. 랑레 요. 나라저 고대체나 나랑 요 삼사 생도 소소시나 띵에 류르스 띵에 심르 띵에 글라바레 야라레 나랑 요 삼사지 생원에서는 라바 강바다 소보다 셈다 초아다 드실라 뜻은 될내내 같이 샤오그마도 저절에 될 메고게 코랑아치 로아치 요나네 랑신지요더라 코라랑게 뭐요더라 그때지 될 메고게 차로 현다도 백화가래서라 다게 뭐샤발라 소보다 셈다 초아던 도시도 메고게 차라 매나 코랑 오치 로가샤기도 뛰어 말아 티 동반저 티 고고라 나라저 섬을 날 텐데스도 나스도 소보다 셈다 때저 파샤네 소소션도 요나르 셔기도 나스게 저랑하듯이 다 치르바죠 이네다 가데 딱지 랑하셔기 나게 집에 기부스 나로 요새거라 당바인게 직부인게 랑하셔인게 수로가 고마래 수질 때고 말해 속에 나올 때고 딱바 땜바 들수 수치된 데메고 속에 나올도 버테는 배 속보다 가가 차라 속에 나올도 봐 속에 차셔게 말아 코란 배 로가 집에 섬을 거다 되나 생각하죠 섬을 나 담다고 요라 나 섬도 직 랑하듯이 지면은 맞대 요라 속보다 초하다 섬라 떼지 될네 에네 가서 누구 대기세 나기 사람직 근데지 뭐도 매나 맞대 요라 말아서 지요 권하셔도 어디 매발 거고야라 그뒤에 찍바래 랑은에 매봐 랑신기 매봐 랑강어 매봐 축축도 매봐 랑은에 있는 축축을 안데르에서 찍거나 현단 될 매고나 군주우주 세치요거나 뛰어 말해 그래서 강간 될 내마도 다 샤투에요 말아 어디 그뒤에 찍바래 뒤엔데 겨단도 사랑 신기야나 샹라 때고 말을 그러 현단 될고 말을 뛰어야 뛰라 어디지 랑나
So here, this is being presented from the Prasangika kind of viewpoint. So when we talk about phenomena not being inherently existent or ultimately existent, objectively existent, sort of solidly, concretely existent, objectively from their own side, here, something that has that kind of existence would not be sort of dependently established, would not be a dependent origination. So we have this kind of sense of like, well, I exist by my own power, right? I exist objectively. When in reality, this I is designated upon the various kind of aggregates. And here, if it were the case that it had that kind of objective existence, it should be something that we can locate aside from, like our form and our mind and so forth, that we can set those aside and be able to point to something that is not contingent upon any of those, that's sort of like objectively existent in and of itself, that's set up by itself. And so here, there are non-Buddhists that assert there is a kind of self that is permanent, unitary, and autonomous. It's something that is permanent, isn't kind of lasting. It doesn't have various parts. It's not as though you can point to this self as being something that is that has any kind of parts, and it is autonomous. It's able to sort of bear analysis or stand up to scrutiny. It isn't just a part of the aggregates, nor is it something merely designated on the kind of aggregates, but rather exists in and of itself. And so here, if we don't have the sense of there being that kind of an I, like we often think that if we didn't have such an I that was sort of set up by itself, that had this kind of autonomous existence, it would be kind of uncomfortable for us, right? But we have this feeling like there is some kind of an I that is set up from its own side, that is inherently existent, ultimately existent, existence by means of its own characteristics, essentially existent. There are many sort of synonyms that the Prasangika school uses, but it seems like there's something that we can point to that isn't dependent upon anything else, that isn't contingent upon our various aggregates, that exists in and of itself. So when we talk about something existing inherently, that is something existing without having to have any kind of dependency or contingency upon other phenomena, that exists by means of its own power. And that is what we are referring to here when we see things like objective existence or inherent existence. That's something that is refuted by the Prasangikas.
Oh yeah, oh dear. Oh, that namshi rangshin ji yode sudo yang kaji ra. Number shibate rangshin ji yode skarasina. Namshi tatarwa de yu tatawan jingido ase. Tisunda ko rangshin ji mena rangwene mena ni yu kadas jingure sigara. Namshi tatawa de yu tatawan jingi yode se. Tisunda wombo da tani rangshin ji yu chenase. Ngadu chena miki sheba ke sudin jindu zandi dagan jin sagura. Dadi pe loga chiyo nani ko ngota desi miki sheba jin mato daga yu min jin sagwa chigira. Sa miki sheba jin jisunu daga yu jin sagura. Lagwara jin naga yu na daga naga sagura. Ko jin drel kukuda sokpo dan drel ni mato daga naga sudu sa. Soku mana na daga koran loga naya siyo mara. Loga yu na ko dadi pe sokpo le los chiyo kora. Tiyo marwa. Tene takwas. Tela tene jide tanya pa tane. Tanya je wanga shara. Kasha je domne ne te je res la. Tena wang res ya. Yebe kong shawara mado. Ane ko chasha tu lega chidu Koran lega chiba shawara. Te chasha la mado ne del chi ne Koran lega chinge. Sopo lega chiba tu taga lega chiba ndugu marwa. Ta Koran lega loga ine tiki chawa chabura. Oh, tisonda tanda de ko samlutansi dira. Namshi tada wa yu tada wan jengi do was. Si mena ane kande jingure sigara. Wa te rangshin ji yu to shi nasi. Ta tela kakwa sigara. Oh, tini rangshin ji yu to chena. Sita mingni chuba ye gemi kolon zinji baas. Ra. Tishi wambu namji ne tada yu da zimbar chese. Pasirisina. Chidari mingni chuba ye game kolo zimbar cheba teshin dose mingla ngazu chik konda mera chipara eni dus kore chabna ke kogo thongura pe tinte pan dusene jogo jogo chene ko kogo thongura ngone de kogo ke yo marwa idan dus shubche ko shene kogo me kogo chithon dekitwa game kolo site sigara chida mingni chuba ye game kolo zinchi baasi, ko jobo jobo korsa, pe tui dengi chi tongi warani, kogo chi tongi dengi towa. Zinchi baasi, jik chiba imari, zinchi baasi udon dewa. Ne tishi wambu namji ne, tade yuda zimbari chesi, odere. Chita mingni chuba yin gemi kolo zimbari cheba, teshin do sigora. Wambu namji ne, tade yuda zimbar sheba yin gyesha. Ombu dan yu dan nambar sheba kanya rangshin ki me do se. Ombu rangshin ki yo mara, yu rangshin ki yo mara. ane number sheba rangshinki yo marasa, rangshinki. Kurang rangshinki yo na, chwe me kuya che, kurang rangshinki yo ra. Shen la te si dene chwe me kuya che kuya ra. Ti si tende re da, na be lu le, tende mayi ki chwe che yo mara. Shen da si mambu che la te si dene, ne rangi ngo tukuru ma to. Su che le te me kuya kurang kyangpa chi ya yo ya chi yo mara, che yo mara. O tende, chwe tamze tenze debar jo. Tene takwa. dakshita chashara mambochila tena ane mingi paa taan te tsamlaa shaakuyara tanya je wanga ye shaakwasi tokpe wanga ye shaakwasi rawa yo mara chashara tena ane tokpe wanga paa tanya taan mingi taashida taga kele kuyara te tsamlaa shaakuyara oya ta kawale so woti chilamna maangdamara chita meni chuba ya gebe kon chiba tishin wambu namjene tade yudan zimbar shira. Chita mini chuba ye geme kolo zimbar shiba tishendo wambu namjene yu tade yudan zimbar shiba yinji esa wambu dan yu nambar shiba kanya rangshinji chuba mete lo chuba la nawa samchira. Rangshinji chuba nangi yora nga ranzulaya. Ti chude yora, norde yora sungara. Lo chuba la nawa samchira. Ti tenpa marisa. Oh yeah, what did you do now? This one.
Oh, oh. So here, if one were to say, well, the present awareness or consciousness by apprehending a present sort of object, the faculty and the sort of object itself would be inherently existent. Now here again, this kind of these realists are trying to assert that both the sort of object as well as the faculty and the visual consciousness that arises from that are all inherently existent. Now, this is something that, again, the Madhyamikas would refute. Again, the I, particularly the person, is something that is designated, dependently designated upon various parts. So when our visual consciousness apprehends an object, we can say, oh, I see that. Or if our hand is hurting, we say, oh, I'm injured, and so forth. But it's not as though there is something that exists in and of itself, but they are rather something that are merely posited by convention, that are merely dependently designated. So here, as it says, then the eye erroneously apprehends the circle formed by a torch being whirled around. Likewise, the sense faculties apprehend objects as if they were in the present. So again, this kind of opponent is trying to assert that there is some sort of inherently existent object, inherently existent faculty, and inherently existent awareness that arises from that. But rather, all of these things, like our apprehension of a kind of, again, if you take a firebrand and whirl it around, it's going to appear as if there's a circle of fire. And so, too, when it comes to this kind of the way in which phenomena exist, it is merely through the kind of being conceptually designated or conventionally posited. So here it is the case that when the sort of parts, there is a basis of designation, and on those various parts, we designate, oh, it is this, or it does this. And so conventionally speaking, we can say that the present consciousness apprehends the present object, but yet it's like this example of when you view a firebrand that is being whirled around, there isn't any actual sort of circle of fire, but rather it's spinning fast, so we perceive it as such. So the faculty, the object, and the consciousness cannot be posited as somehow independently existing existing or being inherently existent, but rather are something that arise dependently. And so here, it's not, the Madhyamakas in particular would assert that there's not able to be some sort of isolated, independent kind of object, but rather it is the case that all phenomena are really a designation upon a collection of parts. We say, oh, this is this, and that is the way in which they exist is dependently designated, is dependent due to, is designated by the power of terms and concepts. On a collection of parts, we say, oh, it is this, or oh, it is that. But there's no actual object of the present, as in no inherently existent object of the present. Rather, it is on the basis of a collection of parts that we designate, oh, that is an object. It appears to us as being inherently existent, but this is something that is false in that way. It's not actually inherently existent. It's merely a kind of mistake of mind, in the same way that when we are whirling around a firebrand, it appears as though it's a circle of fire.
Oh, yeah. That is Sumbala Sum said. Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba Sido. Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba. Wombo Tatara Shinji Tuba Kaba. And Juara Shinji Tuba Kaba. Tena Tara. Do I? Yeah, I need Shashana.
So next we'll be getting into a refutation of the proof of the faculties as being inherently established. But as we've reached time for today, we will leave it there.
Oh, yeah. So look, I'm going to toss on.
No.
I'll get back to short. What is?
Starting with next time, verse 358.
Well, Genrinpoche Kajinche, and thank you so much to Katrina. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Oh, and just to let everybody online know, we will not have class, we have to let Geshe know too that we will not have class next week because we are in a retreat here for Memorial Day weekend. And also the week after, because we have a special resounding event where we'll be reciting the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in 8,000 lines here over Vesak Day. Yeah. No?
Dunja jema zinja yomare gena. Dunja ni.
Dunja
yeah.
Dunja ni ringa.
Long.
Dunja ni zinja yomare.
Zinja yomare.
Oh, yeah. What is that? Oh, yeah. Hakosan.
So he knows that. He's aware.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, she said he's aware of that. Yeah, so everyone check our website online for the latest news, and we will affirm yet again over email. Okay. All right. Okay. So we'll close with some prayers. Sorry for the confusion.
May the spiritual teachers lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Wholesome's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Iram Guru Namandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.